I had been coming out to Colorado since the mid-1940s when I came out with my parents as a kid, and been spending lots of time here and in summers. And in the 50s was going to the Boulder Summer School, which was sponsored by NSF and other people. And they had lecture series, and I talked in the research groups there, and I lectured a couple of summers at the Boulder Summer School. But the first time I got up here was actually 1957. I had an uncle who was a Colorado Supreme Court justice who had an old marble miner's cabin over in Marble, Colorado, across the mountains from here. And he said, "Why don't you come up?" This was after one of the Boulder Summer Schools. "Come up and visit." So I did. Drove over and went up to Marble. The road had just washed out, so it was an interesting experience there. And on the way back, he said, "Go through Aspen." Because I'd gone to Marble, which was around the long way. He said, "Go through Aspen, go back out over Independence Pass." And I did. And it was marvelous. This was a great place. And very interested. Next year I came back, brought my wife back. We went to visit the uncle again, and just looked around the area. Didn't actually do anything. There wasn't any physics here, but just got acquainted with it. That was 1958. Well, then I was based on the East Coast at that point, at Brookhaven National Laboratory and then at Yale. And 1962, I heard that there was going to be a physics center. Well, that wasn't quite the word. There was going to be a physics meeting in Aspen. That sounded very interesting. I'd known Mike Cohn, one of the founders, at the Institute for Advanced Study several years earlier. And I was sharing an office with another young professor at Yale, and he had heard that Cohn was trying to organize something out in the mountains. Well, I'd been coming out anyway to Boulder, but this sounded interesting, so I called Michael Cohn up, and he said, "Sure, come on out, and you're established, you can come contribute to the thing." So we showed up the very beginning of the first summer. The building, which is now Stranahan Hall, wasn't finished. It was in the final stages. So we had offices over at the Aspen Institute buildings, and then moved in here after a week or 10 days. And it was a really great experience because there were people from all over. I'm generally interested in many things, so it was the kind of setting that I like. You weren't just focused on one narrow subject. You were talking to people in all different areas. The Boulder Summer Schools had been much more focused. So this was interesting in an entirely different way, and just loved the area. So after that first summer, I was here about half the summer, I guess, I wrote a letter to Bob Craig, who was the executive director of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, which was sponsoring the physics activities, and said, "Bob, I'd be happy to help with the organization next year if you need some help." And I didn't hear anything back formally, but indeed I came out the next summer and was sort of involved in organizing things and so on. It went on very informally for a few years. And then in 1968, the physicists, the Physics Center, became a separate entity, became a Colorado corporation, separate from the Aspen Institute. And at that point, we had to have trustees and members for the corporation. So I was one of the original trustees, so I'd been involved. And became chairman of the executive committee. By that time, George Stranahan was beginning to get a little bit less involved with the physics activities as such. So I was getting more into the organizational things as he got somewhat out of them. And I continued on as chair of the executive committee, doing these sort of general organizational things for several years. Then became president. The first years here, to say a little bit about what the setting was like for somebody coming in with family, so on. We lived the first year in a house next door to Peter Carruthers, who was another physicist, same age that I knew, who became head of the theory group at Los Alamos. And then the second year was very interesting. We had a little old miner's house across the alley from the house occupied by Robert O. Anderson. Now, Anderson, R.O., was chairman of the board of the Atlantic Richfield Company. And George Stranahan always referred to him as 10 to the 8th Anderson, because he was supposedly possessor of a $100 million fortune at that point, which these days would be $1 billion. And yet, here was this guy who was very informal. He would come home, well, informal, but with high collars, starched, etc. But he'd come home and he'd unbutton the collar, put on his blue jean jacket and his cowboy hat, get out his old Jeep and take the kids out fishing. So he was just here the same way the physicists were enjoying the setting, do whatever you had to do during the day and then go out fishing. And so I got to know him a little bit, and it was just interesting. You got to meet all kinds of people you would never have met otherwise. So getting back to the more organizational things, I became president in 1972, and that was just the time that we had really run out of our first sources of money. And George had been contributing half the budget a couple of years before that, and that wasn't fair, and we had to find some other sources of funds. So I got very involved in trying to get money from the National Science Foundation as the main federal agency that supports work in theoretical physics. And David Pines and I worked on that, and got the first grant in 1973. And that began to put the center on the road to financial stability. We were making a transition. The first few years after incorporation, we were just sort of juveniles, really juveniles, because we didn't have a solid budget. We didn't have well-established operating procedures and so on. We were feeling our way as we went along. In 1973, we began to make a transition. But in those early days, anything we wanted to do, we did ourselves. The National Accelerator Laboratory people, which became Fermilab, had been here earlier in the late 60s and had built a temporary, in quotes, wooden building, pure shell, which was called Hilbert Hall. But it had no insulation, no carpeting on the floor, it was just bare plywood, the whole building. And as one of the kinds of things that we would do, just to make a go of the institution, we would organize work parties, buy a bunch of pizza, and get the physicists to come spend an hour stapling up insulation in Hilbert Hall. We insulated the whole building, did a whole bunch of things like that, moved rocks around for landscaping, whatever needed to be done. We had to do, or it wasn't going to get done because we couldn't afford to hire any staff. So that got a whole lot of people really attached to the place. And the physics, they're very attached from that point of view, but they also got ownership. It was not just going to an established place and being able to do your physics without anybody bothering you or asking you to do anything. If you wanted the place to survive, you had to contribute. So we had a whole lot of that for the first few years there. And with the funding from the National Science Foundation, we began to make the transition to what I would call adolescence. The institution was growing up. We established ways of operating and so on. Mike Simmons has talked a bit about the bookkeeping and activities as treasurer. Actually, he had a couple of things mistaken there, which are not major. But one year, as president, I got a letter from the Internal Revenue Agency saying, "Where is your Form 990?" which all nonprofit institutions have to file every year, which you say things, what your income, expenses, and so on are, so they know you're not making a profit. We were losing money, we weren't making a profit, but you still had to file it. So I filed it for a couple of years, and then there was no institutional memory when the transition was made, so it wasn't filed for a few years. We had lots of little glitches like this because we didn't really have an established way. It didn't have a staff, let's put it that way, who could follow through on things. And one year after we'd had the NSF grant for several years, got a call from NSF, "Send us a copy of your books so we know how you spent the money." The books were not in standard form at all, so I Xeroxed up these sheets and sent them off, and I got a call saying, "Those really are books?" And I said, "Yes, those are really our books, and you can see we spent your money legitimately." Well, they didn't want to go into it in detail, so that was fine. Now, one of the things that we did a lot of, we had a lot of people who liked being here in the mountains. And George Stranahan and I wrote a hiking and climbing guide. George wrote a draft, then I revised it and put in most of the climbing information. And until recently, it was distributed every year by the Physics Center, and it was actually about the best guide to the area, where you could go hiking, how long it would take you, and all the directions on climbs and things. But it would end up, a description would end up of a climb, for example, would say, "Ask an expert." Because most of the published guides, try to give you information, but they don't really tell you what you're going to encounter on the way, except in very general terms. So we did a lot of that. Well, there were a few descriptions in there, I remember, of mountains. A 6-year-old can make this mountain. It's a 14,000-foot peak. A 6-year-old had made the mountain. He was my youngest son. He was not a standard 6-year-old. He is now a stunt man, so he was rather tough. But we did a whole lot of getting out around in the area, and every weekend we'd have a family hike and get everybody out and around, and then one day we'd have a more serious climb. Sometimes I'd have a lot of family members along if it wasn't a particularly serious thing. This went on for a long time, and then finally one year, one trip up, said we're going to climb Castle Peak on Sunday, and got here the start, and there were hordes of kids and families and so on, which wasn't quite what we had in mind. And we got up on Castle Peak, and there was a hailstorm. We had all these wet, cold kids on this mountain ridge. I said, "That's enough. I'm not going to be responsible for these hordes of people anymore." So I stopped organizing those things. But we had a good time, and it was marvelous for kids. My three sons really grew up here in the summers, and some of their best friends are people they've met here from all over the country. Also, they could more or less do whatever they wanted. I was here a couple of summers with just three kids and no spouse or anything, so to have a local girl help me with things. Then 1 year after I'd married Bernice, we were here, and we had a young hippie gentleman who was living in a teepee up Castle Peak, and he was our babysitter. He came, got the kids every day, went off with them fishing, whatever, and they had a marvelous time. Everything worked just very easily. Later on, kids were a little bit older, say in the morning, well, have a nice day. Go off, don't go in the mines, but do whatever you want to otherwise. The youngest one, who became an archaeologist, of course, went in the mines with his friends, and he'd come back with these marvelous things that he'd found. And yet, you knew more or less where they were, and they were around just having a good time. Middle son is the only member of the family who can actually make a living in Aspen. He started working in restaurants here when he was 14, and probably illegal, but he started washing dishes and then prepping and really learning the cooking business, and he became a very excellent chef. He's here in the valley, having been at many of the top restaurants here, and this is where he wants to live. This is where he grew up. Also, in those days, the area around here was rather undeveloped, and oldest son and some of his friends were always making rockets, model rockets. They would go out in what is now the Music Associates parking lot and shoot rockets. So it was just, all the kids just had a marvelous time. So that was a very nice aspect of it. It was easy living here, and the Physics Center would hire physics kids to work around here because, again, the kids would work for not very much salary, and we didn't have very much money, but everyone was connected, so that was very nice. The evolution of the center was very interesting because we got more formal as we got an established budget. The National Science Foundation decided rather early that we were a real bargain. And I remember in the, I think it was probably in the early or middle 80s, Boris Kaiser, who was then the physics chief for, theoretical physics chief for the National Science Foundation, called me up and said, how did you get this going? How do you do this? We're thinking of starting a theoretical physics institute to run in the winter, because Aspen only ran in the summer. And we want to solicit proposals, and we want to know what we should be looking for. How do you run an institution like this, where people can come and collaborate and do good physics without too much bother? And Boris and the NSF had decided that we were their most cost-effective contract, because they put in very little money and they got a tremendous amount of physics. Every year we wrote proposals, and the proposals would list all the papers which had come out of the work here in the previous year, and it was always a large number. So we were established very early as in their minds as a good thing. But at the very first years of the contract, when David Pines and I were working on getting it, he had Marcel Bardon, who was head of all of physics at the NSF, come out and visit. And he sort of gave us instructions on what we should say. And the first proposal was a proposal on workshops on critical problems in theoretical physics. It was something for the National Science Foundation to tie their funding to. This was an era, rather interesting, that they had gotten some flack from Congress and elsewhere because somebody had found out that one of their grantees had spent the summer on the beach in Rio de Janeiro. Is that legitimate research? Yes, in fact, because the person in question was one of the top mathematicians in the world, and he wasn't spending his time on the beach doing nothing. He was doing extremely creative mathematics, but he did not want to be around his home institution. And there were no constraints in the grant that he got where he could spend the money. So he figured, okay, go to South America, have a relaxed time, think about mathematics. There is a saying from one of the most eminent mathematicians of the last century that you've got to stop thinking about mathematics for a while. You're not going to be very creative. You have to take a 6 weeks vacation every year. In the first 3 weeks, you do nothing. You don't think about mathematics, nothing. And then you're allowed, as you get toward the end of that period, to start thinking again. And you come back all fired up. Well, that's the way this young mathematician was operating, and that's actually sort of the key in the creativity from the Physics Center, because people could come here. They aren't on vacation, but they're away from their home institution, and they don't have all the constraints that you normally have. So you get relaxed, you talk to people in different fields, people you would not have seen otherwise, and then you go back inspired and ready to really do some work. Oh, one little incident which was fun. One summer, at some point I was here for about 3 weeks without kids. I think they'd gone home. And I was sharing one of the bachelor apartments with some other young physicists. Well, this wasn't the usual bachelor apartment. This was a house right downtown in Aspen. It was owned by the Benjamin Fairless, the chief executive officer, chairman of the board of U.S. Steel, which was the big company in those days. And among the decorations in the house was a genuine Dwight Eisenhower painting, which was sort of unique, a gift from Eisenhower to Fairless. Well, what was really interesting, though, was the other people I was there with. There was Brian Josephson and Ken Wilson and Leonard Susskind. And we didn't realize it at the time, but this was a pretty potent group, because Brian Josephson won the Nobel Prize a few years later. Ken Wilson won the Nobel Prize a few years later. Leonard Susskind has been one of the top people in theoretical physics at Stanford for years. But we were all just there, attracted to come here to the Physics Center and talking to each other, having a good time. The dinner time conversations were not ones that most people would find very stimulating, but it was fun. Now, one of the things which I wanted to mention is the transitions that took place toward the end of the time I was president. I became very conscious of the fact that I'd been president for 4 years. We had to turn the place over to younger people. And it turns out to be very difficult to do, because the younger people who are around are here to do physics, and until they've come enough times to buy into the place, they aren't especially eager to take on extra responsibilities. They're trying to get away from responsibilities, not take things on. So it's turned out to be surprisingly difficult over the years to get a really good group of younger people to take over. You have to work on it continuously. It's not automatic. But we succeeded, and my attitude from the beginning, which I think some of the other originals don't quite share, is that you turn things over to younger people. You step back. You're there to give them advice and to bail them out if they get into too much trouble, but you let them make their own mistakes. And so the evolution of the physics program has really been in response to younger people getting involved. And they are the ones who know what the needs of the young physics community really are at the time they're coming into power, if you want to call it that. There is no power at the Physics Center. Everything is done by consensus and lots of talking. But they're the ones who really are going to determine what the future is, and they're the ones who know the directions physics is going and how you're going to have to work in order to make progress in those areas. So we've had tremendously good physics coming out of here. I think we'll get to that in future filmings. But it's been in response to letting the younger people push what they think is important, and then providing some backup, make sure the institution keeps running, but let them determine the direction. I had mentioned that when I was president, we were doing everything ourselves, organizing work parties and so on to work on the buildings, make sure everything was at least somewhat comfortable. We had in this old wooden building, Hilbert Hall, we had a couple of Nobel Prize winners sitting in these bare offices. We're sort of, well, we weren't embarrassed. We were trying to make very sure that the younger postdocs and so on didn't feel they were being put upon by being put off in the building. So a lot of the senior people would go off into Hilbert Hall. And so we had a lot of motivation to try to fix that up some. And we did, as I've mentioned. But I remember very clearly several times during that period, I'd be running around in my blue jeans and work shirt and so on, doing things. And people who hadn't been here before, they'd mistake me for the janitor, because every institution has a janitor. So they'd ask me janitorial questions. So that was sort of interesting. I don't take those things very seriously. Anyway, I, over the years, became the buildings and grounds person, having started out there. So still now, many years later, I'm perpetual chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee. And every year I say, well, somebody else ought to learn about the buildings and grounds. I'm probably the only person around who knows where the corner posts on our land are. And oh yes, Bernice knows too. And where various things are around here. But I've kept up interests, stay out of a lot of the activities as far as the organization is concerned, because there are other people doing them. But then I handle buildings and grounds, and have for years also handled sort of the backup. I'm the expert on the center's bylaws and history and so on. So keep involved that way. Well, I mentioned a little bit earlier that during my presidency, we were beginning to get a structure in place. And Sally Mensimer was the secretary. In earlier tapings, Sally had talked about coming out and finding the center and getting involved with it. And she was our main employee. Well, 1973, we actually had an NSF grant. We had some money, and the question arose, could Sally get a big raise? Sally wanted a big raise because she saw herself as running everything. She handled the housing. That's really essential. But as far as the operations of the center, the rest of us were really doing the direction and so on. But Sally thought she should be recognized as being more central and get a big raise. Well, we didn't have enough money for a big raise. We gave her a small raise, and I gave her a title, which was Administrative Vice President, which was absolutely the perfect move as far as smoothing out relations was concerned, because she could write home to Dearborn, Michigan, that she was now an Administrative Vice President. She was delighted. And it was a good title because it really recognized what she was doing, that she was the person doing the administrative activities. And that continued over many years. Jane Kelly then became the second administrative vice president when Sally retired. But that's a position which is appointed every year by the Board of Trustees. And it's been going on since 1973. It's worked very well. Well, the Physics Center has been around now for 43 years. And I guess this is the 44th summer. And is very successful, more successful now than ever in the past. It's just, it is the place for young physicists, young theoretical physicists to come. And there's an attitude which you see in the younger physicists now that you haven't made it unless you've been to Aspen, because that's where you're going to make the connections with the people who are going to be able to promote your career. That's where you're going to make the connections which give you ideas, give you help in getting going on your research. It's been that way the entire time, but the attitudes have changed over the years. Early on, it was a much smaller group of people. In fact, theoretical physics as a whole was much smaller in the 60s and 70s than it is now. Far fewer people involved. So you got to know more people more easily. But the Physics Center was really a very important way for many of us in making connections. It changed the way theoretical physics was done in this country. In Europe, the CERN laboratory had a summer theory program that a lot of people would go to. But this has turned out to be bigger and much more successful because of the way it operates. So it's really become a very important institution for U.S. physics and worldwide physics. We get people from all over the world. But as it's evolved, then the attitude and the field has grown of the younger physicists is that they really have to get to Aspen, really have to get there, make those connections, get their ideas out. It's very important to them to be able to give a talk, talk to the senior people, get their ideas exposed, because with so many people around, it's somewhat difficult to get even very good ideas out and recognized. Some of us used to have the idea, well, you just do good work and it'll get recognized. Well, unfortunately, some promotion also helps. So one of the ways of promoting your ideas is to get here and talk to more senior people, one-on-one. Get their feedback on what you're doing and at the same time inform them of what you think the new directions are. And many of the new directions come from people who are just getting started. They don't have biases about what you should or should not be doing. They just do it, and if it works, wonderful, they become famous. There's been an evolution from the informal collaboration and a very casual approach to program to the present situation, which we have lots of workshops that have grown out of the original NSF requests that we have workshops, but they're probably somewhat excessive, but they do provide a milieu for young physicists to come and present their ideas and get reactions. So that's been very important. Now, a different change which has taken place over the years is that Aspen has gotten very much more expensive. It was always expensive. You know, when we first came here, rent seemed high and land prices seemed outrageous. Rents still seem high, land prices are still outrageous, but probably the rent issue is a real one which has affected the Physics Center in recent years, because it's gotten rather expensive for young physicists to spend long periods of time. We nominally suggest that people be here for at least 3 weeks so they can get involved in what's going on and find out, meet some people, not be just focused on their own little workshop area, but meet some other people and begin to see the other advantages of being here, that you get ideas in totally different subjects that you hadn't thought about before. But they find it expensive. So one of the problems we're facing now is how to increase the support that we can give the postdoctoral type physicists, and that's a real issue for the future. But these things will probably be solved one way or another. The Physics Center has survived so far, and I think it will continue to survive. And it's really very exciting the way it's gone. So I've enjoyed it, and certainly enjoyed being involved. Some people probably wish they could pry me loose, but that's not going to be very easy.